The desert heat pressed down like a heavy blanket as Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her medical pack for the 100th time that morning. At barely 5 feet tall and weighing less than most of the equipment her fellow soldiers carried, she had grown accustomed to the sideways glances and whispered doubts that followed her wherever she went. The other members of Alpha Squad barely acknowledged her presence as they prepared for what intelligence reports called a routine patrol through the contested border region. Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, a barrel-chested man with arms like tree trunks, looked over at Sarah with barely concealed skepticism.
"Doc, you sure you can handle what's coming? This ain't a hospital ward we're heading into."
His voice carried the tone of someone who had already made up his mind about her capabilities. Sarah had heard variations of this question countless times since joining the unit 3 months ago. Fresh out of advanced combat medical training, she possessed more medical knowledge than anyone else in the squad, yet her colleagues seemed fixated on her petite frame rather than her credentials. She had graduated top of her class in both medical school and military training, but somehow that never seemed to matter when the discussion turned to field readiness. "I've been through the same training as everyone else, Sergeant," she replied calmly, checking the supplies in her medical kit one final time. Her voice remained steady, though internally she felt the familiar frustration building. Morphine, bandages, tourniquets, antibiotics, everything was in its designated place, organized with the precision that had earned her recognition from her instructors. Private Johnson, barely 19 and eager to prove himself, chimed in with a laugh that carried no warmth. "Yeah, but training's different from the real thing, document.
What happens when bullets start flying and you freeze up?"
The other soldiers exchanged knowing looks, as if they had already discussed this possibility among themselves. The truth was that Sarah had joined the military medical corps specifically because she wanted to make a difference where it mattered most. Growing up in a family of doctors, she could have easily chosen a comfortable civilian practice, but something inside her had always been drawn to serving those who put their lives on the line for others. Her parents had questioned her decision, worried about the dangers and the physical demands, but Sarah had been determined to prove that courage and skill mattered more than size and gender. Captain Williams, the squad leader, called for final equipment checks. Sarah watched as each soldier went through their weapons and gear with practiced efficiency. Their movements spoke of months or years of experience in hostile territory, while she still felt like an outsider trying to earn her place among them. The captain himself had been polite but distant since her arrival, treating her more like a medical consultant than a full member of the team. As they moved out in formation, Sarah found herself positioned in the center of the group, surrounded by the others in what was supposedly a protective configuration. She understood the tactical reasoning, but it also reinforced her status as someone who needed protection rather than someone capable of providing it. The weight of her medical pack felt heavier with each step, not because of its physical burden, but because of what it represented, her role as a support player rather than a true combatant. The landscape around them was desolate and unforgiving, with rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation providing little cover. Intelligence reports had indicated minimal enemy activity in the area, but Sarah had learned enough about military operations to know that such reports were often outdated or incomplete. The silence among the squad members as they walked spoke of their own awareness of the potential dangers ahead.
3 hours into the patrol, they reached their designated checkpoint without incident.
The communications equipment crackled to life as Captain Williams reported their position to base command. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan, and Sarah began to wonder if perhaps this would indeed be the routine mission that had been promised. She used the brief rest to check on the squad members, taking note of their hydration levels and watching for any signs of heat exhaustion. It was during this moment of relative calm that Sarah first noticed the glint of reflected sunlight from a ridge approximately 800 meters to their east. Her medical training had taught her to be observant, to notice details that others might miss, and something about that brief flash of light sent a chill down her spine despite the oppressive heat. She raised her binoculars and scanned the area carefully, but saw nothing that seemed immediately threatening. "Captain," she called out quietly, "I think I saw something on that eastern ridge." Her voice was steady, but she could feel the familiar knot of tension forming in her stomach. She had learned to trust her instincts during training, even when others dismissed her concerns. Captain Williams looked in the direction she indicated, his own binoculars raised. After a long moment, he lowered them and shook his head. "I don't see anything, document probably just rocks or maybe a piece of debris catching the light. His tone suggested that he considered her observation to be the product of inexperience rather than genuine concern. Sergeant Rodriguez overheard the exchange and added his own assessment. New people always see things that aren't there. Document desert plays tricks on your eyes, especially when you're not used to it. The other soldiers nodded in agreement, and Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment. Perhaps they were right, perhaps she was just jumping at shadows. But, as they prepared to move out again, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her medical training had taught her to trust her observations and instincts, qualities that had served her well in diagnosing patients under pressure. Now, as she shouldered her pack and took her place in the formation, those same instincts were telling her that something was very wrong with their current situation. The squad resumed their patrol, moving toward their next checkpoint along a route that would take them through a narrow valley between two rocky hills. Sarah found herself constantly glancing toward the eastern ridge, unable to forget that momentary flash of light. She wished she had more experience to draw upon, more credibility with her teammates that would make them take her concerns seriously. Instead, she was forced to keep her worries to herself and hope that her intuition was wrong. As they entered the valley, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The terrain here offered multiple vantage points for potential observers, and Sarah found herself thinking about fields of fire, escape routes, and defensive positions, concepts that had been drilled into her during combat training but which now took on a more immediate and personal significance. She checked her sidearm, a Beretta M9 that she had qualified with but hoped never to use outside of training exercises. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Captain Williams called for another rest break. They were roughly halfway through their planned route, and so far everything had proceeded without incident. Sarah used the opportunity to conduct another informal medical check on the squad, noting that everyone seemed to be handling the heat and exertion well. Private Johnson even managed a grudging nod of acknowledgement when she handed him an extra water purification tablet. It was during this break that Sarah's worst fears were confirmed. The attack came without warning, a coordinated assault from multiple positions that caught the squad completely off guard. The first shots rang out from the eastern ridge, exactly where Sarah had seen that initial flash of reflected light hours earlier. Her heart sank as she realized that her instincts had been correct, but there was no time for vindication or recrimination. The world around her exploded into chaos as bullets whined overhead and ricocheted off the rocky ground around them. Captain Williams was shouting orders, trying to coordinate their response while seeking cover behind a large boulder. Sergeant Rodriguez was returning fire with his rifle, but it was clear that they were outgunned and in a tactically disadvantageous position. The narrow valley that had seemed like a convenient route now revealed itself as a carefully prepared killing zone. Sarah pressed herself against a rock formation, her heart pounding as she watched her squadmates scramble for cover. This was the moment everyone had been wondering about: how would the small, inexperienced medic react when the shooting started? She could feel their eyes on her, even in the midst of the firefight, waiting to see if she would freeze up or panic. The weight of their expectations, combined with the very real danger of the situation, threatened to overwhelm her completely. The gunfire was relentless, and Sarah could see that their attackers had them pinned down from at least 3 different positions. Captain Williams was trying to establish radio contact with base, but the rocky terrain was interfering with their communications. Sergeant Rodriguez continued to lay down suppressing fire, but his ammunition wouldn't last forever, and the enemy seemed to have an endless supply of rounds to pour down into the valley. Sarah's medical training kicked in as she assessed the tactical situation with the same methodical approach she used to diagnose patients. The enemy had chosen their ambush site well. The squad was trapped in a depression with limited cover and few escape routes. However, her position against the rock formation gave her a unique vantage point to observe the attackers' positions without exposing herself to direct fire. Through careful observation, Sarah began to identify patterns in the enemy's fire. There were definitely 3 shooter positions, but she noticed that the gunfire from the northern position seemed less coordinated than the others. While the eastern and southern positions maintained steady, disciplined fire, the northern shooter seemed to be firing in shorter, more erratic bursts. This suggested either a less experienced fighter or possibly someone who was wounded or operating with limited ammunition. Private Johnson suddenly cried out in pain and collapsed behind his cover, clutching his left shoulder. Blood was seeping through his fingers, and Sarah could see that he needed immediate medical attention. Without hesitation, she began to move toward him, staying low and using every piece of available cover. The route required her to cross approximately 15 feet of open ground where she would be exposed to enemy fire.
"Doc, stay down,"
Sergeant Rodriguez shouted over the gunfire.
"You'll get yourself killed."
His concern was genuine, but Sarah had already committed to reaching the wounded soldier. Her medical oath compelled her to treat the injured regardless of the personal risk, and Private Johnson's condition could deteriorate rapidly if left untreated. Sarah sprinted across the open space, her medical pack bouncing on her back as bullets kicked up dirt around her feet. She reached Johnson's position and immediately began assessing his wound while keeping her head below the level of the rocks that provided their cover. The bullet had entered through his shoulder and exited cleanly, missing major arteries but causing significant tissue damage and blood loss. "This is going to hurt, but I need to stop the bleeding," she told Johnson as she worked quickly to apply pressure bandages and administer pain medication. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, the countless hours of medical training taking over despite the chaos surrounding them. Johnson's face was pale with shock and blood loss, but his vital signs remained stable. While treating Johnson, Sarah continued to analyze their tactical situation. The enemy fire was coming from fixed positions, suggesting that the attackers were planning to keep the squad pinned down until they ran out of ammunition or until reinforcements arrived. However, Sarah had noticed something during her dash to reach Johnson. The northern position had stopped firing entirely during her movement, which meant either the shooter had been eliminated or had relocated. Captain Williams crawled over to their position, keeping his head low.
"How is he, Doc?"
His voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been there before. Seeing Sarah risk her life to treat a wounded teammate had clearly changed his perception of her capabilities. "He'll live, but we need to get him out of here soon," Sarah replied while continuing to monitor Johnson's condition. "The bleeding is under control, but he needs proper surgical attention within the next few hours." She paused to duck lower as a burst of gunfire passed overhead.
"Captain, I think the northern position has been abandoned or neutralized. If we could get someone up there, they might be able to flank the other positions." Captain Williams looked at her with surprise. "You sure about that, Doc? How can you tell?"
His question wasn't dismissive this time, he was genuinely seeking her assessment of the situation. Sarah explained her observations about the different firing patterns and the complete silence from the northern position during the past several minutes. Captain Williams listened carefully, then used his binoculars to study the terrain. After several minutes of observation, he nodded slowly.
"You might be right. The question is, who do we send up there?"
The answer came to Sarah immediately, though she hesitated to voice it. She was the smallest member of the squad, which would make her the hardest target to spot during movement. She also had the best view of the enemy positions from her current location, which meant she could identify the safest route to the northern ridge. Most importantly, she was beginning to realize that proving herself to her teammates required more than just medical competence, it required demonstrating courage under fire. "I'll go," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I'm the smallest, and I know exactly where the safe routes are from watching their fire patterns."
She could see the immediate objection forming on Captain Williams' face, so she continued quickly. "Sir, with respect, I'm the logical choice.
Johnson needs someone to stay with him, and we need our heavy weapons people here to keep up the suppressing fire." Sergeant Rodriguez overheard the conversation and immediately protested.
"Doc, that's suicide.
You're a medic, not an assault trooper.
Your job is to keep us alive, not to go charging up hills."
Despite his earlier skepticism about her abilities, he was now genuinely concerned for her safety.
Sarah checked Johnson's bandages one final time and made sure his pain medication was taking effect.
"Sergeant, my job is to ensure the survival of this squad. Sometimes that means treating wounds, and sometimes it means taking out the people who are causing those wounds."
She looked each of them in the eye.
"Besides, I know exactly where they are and where they aren't looking."
"That's more important than size or experience right now."
Captain Williams studied her face for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the decision. Military doctrine said that medics should be protected and kept out of direct combat whenever possible, but their current situation defied standard doctrine.
They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running low on ammunition. Unconventional problems sometimes required unconventional solutions.
"What's your plan, Doc?" he asked finally. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude that he was willing to listen to her tactical assessment rather than dismissing it outright. Sarah outlined her intended route up the northern slope, explaining how she could use the natural rock formations for concealment while staying out of the line of sight from the other enemy positions. She had studied the terrain carefully during the firefight and had identified a path that would be invisible from the eastern and southern positions. The key was timing her movement to coincide with periods of heavy firing, when the enemy shooters would be focused on their targets rather than scanning for flanking movements. "Once I reach the northern position, I can assess the situation and either eliminate any remaining enemies or signal you about what I find up there," she continued. "If the position is truly abandoned, I might be able to get a clear shot at one of the other positions from there."
Captain Williams nodded slowly. "What about weapons? You qualified with the M9, but do you have rifle training?"
Sarah confirmed that she had completed basic rifle training, though she acknowledged that her experience was limited compared to the other squad members.
Sergeant Rodriguez reluctantly handed over his backup rifle, a lightweight M4 carbine.
"Doc, if you're really going to do this crazy thing, you'll need more than that sidearm." He quickly showed her the specific features of his weapon and handed over several magazines of ammunition. "Remember, short controlled bursts, and don't try to be a hero up there. Get a read on the situation and get back down here in one piece." Sarah secured the rifle and additional ammunition, then took several deep breaths to calm her nerves. She had trained for combat situations, but this would be her first real engagement with enemy forces. Everything she had learned about marksmanship, tactics, and field medicine was about to be put to the ultimate test. The weight of her squadmates' lives rested on her shoulders, and she could feel their eyes watching her as she prepared to move. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. 3 hours earlier, these same men had questioned whether she could handle herself in a firefight. Now they were counting on her to potentially save their lives through a dangerous flanking maneuver. She thought briefly about her parents and wondered what they would think if they could see her now, preparing to engage enemy combatants in direct combat. Sarah waited for the next heavy exchange of gunfire, then began her movement up the northern slope. She moved in short rushes, using every boulder and depression for concealment while constantly monitoring the enemy positions for any sign that she had been detected. Her small stature, which had been a source of doubt among her teammates, now became a significant tactical advantage as she was able to use cover that would have been inadequate for larger soldiers. The climb was more challenging than she had anticipated. The rocky terrain was loose and unstable, requiring her to move carefully to avoid creating noise that might alert the enemy to her position. Her medical pack, usually a familiar and comfortable weight, now felt cumbersome and threatened to throw off her balance as she navigated the steep incline. She had to pause frequently to catch her breath and ensure that her route remained concealed from the other enemy positions.
Halfway up the slope, Sarah encountered an unexpected obstacle.
A section of the hillside had collapsed, creating a gap in her planned route that would force her to either backtrack significantly or risk exposure while crossing a stretch of open ground. She could hear the continued exchange of gunfire below, knowing that her squadmates were depending on her success while their ammunition supplies dwindled with each passing minute. Sarah chose to continue forward, timing her movement across the exposed area to coincide with a particularly intense burst of enemy fire from the eastern position. She sprinted across the open ground, her heart pounding as she anticipated the crack of rifle fire directed at her position. Instead, she reached the safety of another rock formation without drawing any apparent attention from the enemy forces. As she approached the northern position, Sarah could smell the acrid scent of gunpowder and something else, the metallic smell of blood. She proceeded with extreme caution, her rifle ready as she closed the final distance to what she hoped was an abandoned enemy fighting position. The silence from this location was now complete, with no sound of movement or breathing that would indicate a live enemy presence. The first thing Sarah saw when she reached the position was a crude fighting position carved out between several large rocks. Spent shell casings littered the ground, indicating that this position had indeed been actively used during the ambush. But what caught her attention immediately was the body of an enemy combatant slumped against the rocks, a pool of blood beneath him suggesting that he had been killed by return fire from her squadmates below. Sarah quickly checked the body to confirm that the threat was neutralized, then turned her attention to the tactical situation. From this elevated position, she had a clear view of both remaining enemy positions and could see exactly how they had orchestrated the ambush. The eastern position was built around a natural cave opening that provided excellent protection from return fire, while the southern position consisted of a series of connected firing points among large boulders.
More importantly, Sarah could see something that her squadmates couldn't observe from their position in the valley floor.
The enemy forces consisted of only 4 combatants total, 2 in the eastern position and 2 in the southern position. This was a much smaller force than they had initially assumed, but they had been able to create the impression of a larger unit through coordinated fire and good positioning. Sarah used her radio to contact Captain Williams, keeping her voice low to avoid detection by the remaining enemies.
"Captain, this is document northern position is secured. Single Kia enemy combatant, position is now clear."
She paused to observe the other positions more carefully.
"I count 4 total enemy combatants, 2 at each remaining position.
Eastern position has better cover but limited fields of fire.
Southern position is more exposed but has better visibility of your location."
Captain Williams' voice crackled back through the radio with obvious relief and surprise.
"Outstanding work, document. What's your assessment of our tactical options from up there?"
The respect in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt a surge of confidence that she was finally proving herself worthy of her teammates' trust.
From her new vantage point, Sarah could see that the southern position was indeed more vulnerable than it appeared from below.
While the enemy fighters there had excellent visibility of the squad's location, their own position was exposed to flanking fire from the north. Even more importantly, she noticed that they had positioned their supplies and what appeared to be additional weapons behind their firing position, in an area that would be completely exposed to accurate rifle fire from her current location. "Captain, I have a clear shot at their supply area and possibly at the southern position itself," Sarah reported. "If I can eliminate or suppress the southern position, you should be able to maneuver against the eastern position without taking fire from multiple directions." She studied the terrain carefully, planning her shots to maximize their impact on the enemy's ability to maintain their ambush. Sarah had never fired her weapon in combat before, and she felt the weight of that responsibility as she prepared to engage. Her rifle training had been thorough, but shooting at human targets was fundamentally different from shooting at paper targets on a range. She forced herself to focus on the tactical situation rather than the moral implications of what she was about to do. These enemy combatants had already wounded one of her teammates and were actively trying to kill the rest of her squad. She selected her first target carefully, a stack of ammunition boxes positioned behind the southern fighting position. Destroying or scattering their ammunition would significantly reduce their ability to maintain effective fire, even if she didn't immediately neutralize the shooters themselves. Sarah adjusted her rifle's sights for the range and wind conditions, then controlled her breathing as she had been taught during marksmanship training. The first shot was perfectly placed, striking the ammunition boxes and causing them to scatter across the rocky ground. The immediate effect was visible as the enemy fighters in the southern position scrambled to recover their scattered supplies. This movement exposed them to Sarah's line of sight, and she was able to place accurate fire that forced them to abandon their carefully prepared positions and seek less effective cover. The impact on the tactical situation was immediate and dramatic. With the southern position effectively suppressed, Captain Williams was able to maneuver Sergeant Rodriguez and another squad member to a flanking position against the eastern position. The enemy fighters there found themselves caught between accurate rifle fire from 2 directions and quickly realized that their carefully planned ambush had turned against them. Sarah continued to provide overwatch from the northern position, her medical training helping her to remain calm and analytical despite the intensity of the firefight. She could see that the enemy's coordinated defense was breaking down as they struggled to respond to threats from multiple directions. The psychological impact of having their own ambush turned against them was clearly affecting their decision-making and accuracy. Within 10 minutes, the firefight was over. The remaining enemy combatants had either been eliminated or had fled their positions entirely, leaving behind their weapons and equipment. Sarah maintained her overwatch position until Captain Williams confirmed that the area was secure, then began making her way back down the northern slope to rejoin her squad. The descent was easier than the climb had been, but Sarah found that the adrenaline was beginning to wear off and the full impact of what had just happened was starting to sink in. She had successfully executed her first combat mission, turning the tide of a potentially disastrous ambush and likely saving the lives of her entire squad. The realization was both exhilarating and sobering, marking a fundamental change in how she viewed herself and her role within the unit. When Sarah reached the valley floor, she found her squadmates treating their equipment and preparing to move out of the area. Private Johnson was sitting up and looking much better, though he would still need proper medical attention once they returned to base. The expressions on her teammates' faces had changed completely from the skepticism and doubt she had endured that morning.
Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to speak as she approached their position.
"Doc, that was some of the finest tactical shooting I've seen in 15 years of military service." His voice carried genuine admiration rather than the patronizing tone she had grown accustomed to hearing. "You saved our lives up there, and you did it with precision and professionalism." Captain Williams nodded in agreement as he finished his radio report to base command.
"Outstanding work, Dr. Chen.
Your tactical assessment was spot on, and your execution was flawless." The use of her formal title and rank was significant, indicating that she had finally earned her place as a respected member of the team rather than just a medical attachment. The journey back to base took on a completely different atmosphere than the morning patrol. Where there had once been skeptical glances and dismissive comments, Sarah now found herself walking alongside teammates who sought her opinions on tactical matters and listened carefully to her observations about the terrain and potential threats. The transformation was remarkable, but it also carried the weight of new responsibilities and expectations. Private Johnson, despite his wound, made a point of thanking Sarah personally for the risk she had taken to treat him under fire. "Doc, when I saw you running across that open ground with bullets flying everywhere, I thought you were crazy," he admitted with a sheepish grin.
"Now I realize you were just braver than the rest of us."
His words meant more to Sarah than any formal commendation could have, representing genuine acceptance from someone who had previously questioned her capabilities. As they walked, Captain Williams discussed the tactical lessons learned from the engagement.
"Your observation about the reflected light was spot on, document. We should have taken that more seriously."
He paused to check his map before continuing. "In the future, when you see something that doesn't look right, I want you to speak up again, even if the rest of us don't see it immediately. Your medical training gives you a different perspective on observation and analysis that obviously has value in combat situations."
Sergeant Rodriguez added his own assessment of Sarah's performance during the flanking maneuver. "The way you analyzed their fire patterns and identified that weakness in the northern position, that was professional-level tactical thinking.
Most soldiers take years to develop that kind of situational awareness." He adjusted his pack and looked at Sarah with obvious respect.
"Where did you learn to think like that?"
Sarah explained that her medical training had taught her to observe patterns, identify anomalies, and make critical decisions under extreme pressure. When you're treating trauma patients, you have to process multiple streams of information simultaneously and prioritize your actions based on limited data, she said. The skills are transferable, whether you're diagnosing internal bleeding or analyzing enemy fire patterns, the process is fundamentally the same. The conversation continued as they made their way through the desert landscape, but Sarah found herself reflecting on the broader implications of what had happened. She had proven herself capable in combat, but, more importantly, she had demonstrated that her unique background and training brought value to the team that went beyond traditional medical support. The integration of medical and tactical thinking had created new possibilities for how she could contribute to future missions. When they reached the base perimeter, word of their engagement had already spread through unofficial channels. Other medical personnel wanted to hear the details of how Sarah had treated Johnson under fire, while combat personnel were curious about her tactical performance during the flanking maneuver. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of being respected by both communities, bridging a gap that often existed between medical and combat personnel. The formal debriefing took place in the operations center, with senior officers asking detailed questions about every aspect of the engagement. Sarah's account of the enemy positions and tactics was given equal weight with the observations of the more experienced combat personnel, a level of respect that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. Her tactical sketches of the enemy positions were incorporated into the intelligence reports that would be used to plan future operations in the area. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, reviewed the incident reports with obvious interest.
Dr. Chen, your performance today demonstrates exactly the kind of integrated thinking we need in modern combat operations, he said during the debriefing. Medical personnel who understand tactics, and tactical personnel who understand medical priorities, that's the future of military effectiveness. He paused to review her personnel file. I'm recommending you for advanced tactical training to complement your medical qualifications. The recommendation for additional training was both an honor and a recognition that Sarah's role within the unit was evolving beyond traditional medical support. She would continue to serve as the squad's primary medical officer, but now with the additional responsibility of providing tactical analysis and potentially participating in combat operations when situations required her unique skill set. In the days following the engagement, Sarah noticed that her relationship with her squadmates had fundamentally changed. They sought her opinions on tactical matters, included her in planning discussions, and treated her as a full partner in mission preparation rather than someone who needed protection. The respect was genuine and hard-earned, based on demonstrated competence under pressure rather than sympathy or political correctness. Private Johnson recovered fully from his wound and returned to active duty within 2 weeks. During his recovery, he made a point of telling anyone who would listen about how Dr. Chen had risked her life to save him and then single-handedly turned the tide of the ambush. His account, combined with the official reports, helped establish Sarah's reputation throughout the base as a medical officer who could be counted on in any situation. Sergeant Rodriguez became one of Sarah's strongest advocates, working with her to develop integrated medical tactical training programs that could benefit other units. Doc's got something special, he told other squad leaders. She thinks like a medic and fights like a soldier, and that combination makes everyone around her more effective. His endorsement carried significant weight among the non-commissioned officers who formed the backbone of the military organization. Captain Williams included Sarah in all tactical planning sessions for future missions, valuing her unique perspective on risk assessment and casualty prevention. Having someone who can think about both keeping people alive and accomplishing the mission objectives gives us options we didn't have before, he explained to his superiors. Dr. Chen proved that medical personnel can contribute to tactical success in ways we hadn't fully appreciated. The success of the mission had broader implications beyond just Sarah's personal development. It demonstrated that the integration of medical and combat training could produce personnel who were more adaptable and effective in complex situations. Military medical education began incorporating more tactical training, while combat personnel received enhanced medical training to create more well-rounded soldiers. 6 months later, Sarah was selected to help develop new training programs that would prepare future combat medics for the realities of modern warfare. Her experience had shown that the traditional separation between medical and combat roles was less relevant in actual field conditions, where personnel needed to be prepared for any eventuality. The programs she helped design would produce medics who were fully integrated members of combat teams rather than protected specialists. Looking back on that day in the desert, Sarah realized that proving herself had required more than just medical competence or even physical courage. It had required her to synthesize all of her training and experience into a new understanding of her role and capabilities. The respect of her teammates had been earned through demonstrated performance under the most demanding conditions possible. The small doctor who had been underestimated and dismissed had become a respected combat veteran whose opinions were sought and valued. But, more importantly, she had helped redefine what it meant to be a military medical professional in an era where the lines between traditional roles were increasingly blurred. Her legacy would be measured not just in lives saved through medical treatment, but in the expanded possibilities for future generations of military medical personnel. The desert engagement had transformed Sarah from an outsider seeking acceptance into a leader helping to shape the future of military medicine.
She had struck back against both enemy forces and the limitations that others had tried to place on her capabilities, proving that true strength comes from the integration of knowledge, skill, and courage rather than from physical size or traditional gender roles. The girl who had once been seen as too small for military service had become a symbol of how individual excellence could transcend conventional expectations and create new possibilities for everyone who followed.